Welcome to the latest installment of the Torrey Botanical Society's Torrey Talks lecture series. My name is Catherine Mercier, and I'm the programming chair. I want to start by talking a little bit about the society in general. So the Torrey Botanical Society was founded in 1867 and is an organization for anybody interested in plant life, including professional and amateur botanists, students, and anyone who simply enjoys nature. Today, the objectives of the Society are to promote interest in botany and to collect and disseminate information on all phases of plant science. These objectives are fulfilled through meetings, field trips, public lectures, publications, funding of research and education, and sponsorship of symposia and regional conferences. So, public lectures like the one we're having right now. And also I want to highlight our field trip this weekend to Woodlawn Cemetery, which is happening on Sunday at noon. And for more information on that, you can check out our website, torreybotanical.org. And to find out more about the society, to become a member, and to stay up to date on everything we're doing, you can also check out torreybotanical.org, our website. This season, our lecture series is featuring botanists who were previously awarded a graduate student research fellowship from the Society. This award is open to PhDs and master's students who are members of the Society and helps cover the costs of fieldwork. We also have a related award for undergraduate students and some more specific awards. These grants are currently accepting applications, so make sure to check out the website, torreybotanical.org. You can also follow us on social media. Our social media handles are up on the screen right now. We are at Torrey Botanical almost everywhere, except for on YouTube, we are at Torrey Botanical Society. Before we begin the talk, just a quick few notes about Zoom. Please keep yourself muted while the talk is happening, but you're free to have your camera on or off. You're welcome to ask questions as we go. Please just raise your hand and Blaire will take your question. When we reach sort of the end of the talk, the Q&A portion of the night, and you want to ask a question, you can either put that in the chat and I'll read it out, or you can, again, use the raise your hand feature and unmute and ask your question. If you would like to share the talk or watch it again later, it will be recorded and available on the YouTube page at Torrey Botanical Society, along with all of our recent previous talks. So tonight's talk will be presented by, I lost my notes, by Blaire Kleiman from Florida International University. Blaire was awarded Torrey's Graduate Student Research Fellowship in 2020 to study crop insect interactions in South Florida while they were working on their master's at FIU. At the time, they were looking at how weeds or any wild plant left within a mango farm would affect insect abundance and diversity in the farm. They found that there was a higher abundance and diversity of beneficial insect species and more fruit on mango trees when weeds were present versus when they were removed. Now she's working on her PhD, studying how climate change may impact these same crop pollinator systems by studying the physiology of the crops and pollinators and their interactions in relation to changing climates. And with that, I will hand it over to Blaire.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. Can everybody see my screen?
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. So good evening. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your time. And I am going to be talking about my master's research, which was funded graciously by the Torrey Botanical Society in 2021. And my master's research was looking at how weeds affect insects in mango cultivation, but my talk tonight is going to be a little bit more broad about the plant-insect interactions and ecology in agriculture in South Florida. And currently I am a PhD student now at Florida International University, and my PhD research is also plant insect ecology, but looking at how climate change and heat stress affects crops and pollinators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my current research now as well. And as we move along, if you have a question, please just interrupt me or feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom chat if you want to have a question or a comment as we go along. So I just want to introduce you guys to the topic of insects and plants and the ecological interactions between them on a broad scale, looking in my field of agriculture. And so we can think about plants as the beginning of the trophic interactions or the food web. And of course, we're familiar with herbivores or in this case, insects, which eat plants and consume plants. And for my master's, I looked at weeds as the basis of this food chain. And then in agriculture here, we can think about herbivorous pests. So on this bottom right corner, you can see aphids. And aphids, I'm sure we're all very familiar with them, are pests that consume the phloem in a plant. And they have little stylet mouth parts that pierce and suck the plant juice. And consuming the aphids and moving up the trophic food web, we have their predators. So this top image, and here this is a syrphid or a hoverfly larvae. And these are common predators of aphids and of other pest species. And another beneficial insect that we want to boost its population in agriculture is parasitoids. And parasitoids are insects that inject their eggs into a host to feed on and ultimately kill. And they're beneficial because they will usually help to control our pest populations. So we want to boost predators and parasitoids. And finally, pollinators, which we're all familiar with. These are insects that feed in flowers and as a result will pollinate your plants. So we want to boost these beneficial insects and hopefully reduce our pest or herbivorous insects. And there's interactions among them and between them and with the plants as well, and between crops and non-crop plants or weeds. So here I compiled a list of potential insectary plants, and these are plants that are mostly flowering species that can help to boost our beneficial insect populations, and hopefully, as a result, your crop will be protected and pollinated. And so here, this is a list that is specific for South Florida that I think we should plant in the FIU organic garden on campus. However, a lot of these are non-native and herbaceous plants that could certainly be planted everywhere else as well. And so I just want to introduce you to some that I'll talk about tonight, and these are highlighted. The non-native species are buckwheat and sweet alyssum. And this is, you are probably familiar with them or at least have seen them. These are two very newly studied insectary plants to be used in agriculture. And the third I'll talk about tonight is the Biden's alba, or commonly known as beggar ticks or Spanish needle. And this is the most abundant weed species that we have in the state of Florida. So these are three that I will talk about tonight that have potential to be insectary plants. So as I said, Biden's alba is it's the third most common source of nectar for insects in the state of Florida. It is the most abundant weed species that we have in South Florida. And so if you want to think what could potentially be the first two most abundant sources of nectar for insects in Florida, if you think of Florida, what do we grow a lot of and have a lot of? I'll spoil it for you. Number one is oranges, and number two is saw palmetto. So after oranges and saw palmetto, and oranges have a bunch of their own problems for growing and are slowly dwindling in production, but still Biden's is number three. as far as the most abundant source of nectar. And this is because it grows as a weed. It is really easy to grow, grows in any type of soil, disturbed soil, native natural habitats, in pavement, in my backyard, it's everywhere. And as a result, it is always supplying pollen and nectar. And so think about, what do our beneficial insects need is for pollinators and parasitoids, they feed in flowers. So they need pollen and nectar. And predators, they can feed off of herbivores that are feeding on Biden's alpha. So Bidens can support by floral resources and alternative prey resources are beneficial insects. And because it's a weed, it has a quick turnover. It blooms year long in Florida, and it has been found to support some predators and parasitoids. However, no study has, as of now, documented the pollination support and attraction of Biden's alba. And so here you can see it for pollinators. Certainly, I found that Bidens is a very attractive floral resource for pollinators, especially honeybees, but other native bees and fly pollinators are very attracted to the flowers. It's in the Asteraceae family and has these abundant floral resources for a variety of pollinators. So, okay. So just making sure my slides are moving. So looking at floral diversity provided by weeds, this is extremely important, especially in farms, because there is currently a pollinator decline crisis that we are experiencing across the globe, and especially in areas of intensive farming. So we have fewer pollinators, yet increasing agricultural reliance on them, of course, to feed growing populations. And a lot of farmers will use herbicides and pesticides to reduce weeds, and oftentimes this will limit the availability of nectar for pollinators, which, given these weedy resources, can use them as alternative resources before, during, and after the bloom of a crop. And it's been found that they actually increase the yields of a crop when given these resources. So if we know this, and we also know that resident pollinators are healthiest with at least 15 flowering species on a farm, what do we think for a farm that only has one flower? Say, we can think of mango, that only blooms for a short period of time, and the rest of the year there is no floral resources if you're removing the weeds. This is obviously detrimental to our pollinators. So this is why, for my master's, I looked at creating strips or pockets of flowering weeds within farms, especially monocultures, as is the most common form of agriculture, to benefit, most importantly, our native pollinators. So using weeds as pollinator magnets is important because it can help to ensure sufficient pollination, especially of crops where native pollination or native pollinators are the most efficient. And this is the case of mango. And we know that 75% of flowering plants rely on pollinators, and for crops, almost 35% of crops globally depend on pollination. And the annual economic value of these insects are $173 billion worldwide. And this number is certainly higher given the recent economic and inflation. So this is probably greater than $173 billion a year. And pollination by bees is actually, and other animals, actually increases the stability and the quality of harvest for 70% of our leading global crops, including mango. And mango is a tropical crop, which is pollinated primarily by social bees and flies. And this mango and other tropical crops are the most susceptible to pollination failure from habitat loss because of their reliance on these tropical non-honeybee pollinators. So wild bees, most importantly, can provide billions of dollars a year in crop pollination with no cost to farmers for this ecosystem service. Okay, so looking at weeds now, The benefits of weeds are, of course, they are free to farmers. They reduce the cost, time, and the chemical use in not having to remove them. They can provide large expanses of resources for insects, and they can increase the diversity of our native pollinators, which will buffer against the lapses in pollination from our troubled honeybees, the European Apis mellifera. And they can potentially help to expand beneficial insects ranges throughout monocultures, which is what I looked at. So the objective of my master's was to determine the effects of weeds as refuge resource plants to enhance both the abundance and diversity of beneficial insects to ultimately benefit mango crop production in South Florida. My hypotheses were there will be a higher abundance and diversity of beneficial insects on weeds in the crop when weeds are present, and ultimately there will be a higher fruit count per tree in the weed treatment when compared to the no weed treatment. So for my methods, my study site was on a large mango farm in Homestead, Florida, which is in South Florida. And I used all variety kits mango, which you may not be familiar with, but we are very lucky that it was bred and developed here in Homestead. And it's one of the most delicious mangoes you will ever have. I had 2 treatments applied to the mango trees, a weedy treatment and a no weed treatment. And for the weed treatments, weed growth was allowed between the mango trees, and the no weed treatment, they were removed using mechanical means such as a string trimmer. I recorded and collected the insects interacting on both treatments and on the mango trees. And insects and weeds were collected and identified. And the study was completed within 1 year, and fruit yield per tree was quantified at the end of the study. Okay, so here looking at some of my results, this is just a snapshot or a part of the total weed list that was published in one of my papers. But looking at the results of the weed species encountered, there were 75 different weed species from 27 families identified, and 34 were native and 38 were non-native, of which 6 were category 1 invasive and 5 category 2 invasive. And so invasives are termed category 1 when they're altering the native plant community or hybridizing with the natives. And category 2 are exotics that have increased in abundance but aren't yet altering the Florida plant community to the extent of category 1. And looking at the results of the insect types and the next slide, the fruit yield results on the mango, we saw a significant effect of weeds on the mango flower visitors, or the pollinators, as well as the parasitoids. And there was nearly a significant difference between herbivores on the mango trees. However, there was no difference in the predators. So why did we see this? What is the potential result of reason for this? It could be because of the significant increase in the flower visitors from the added floral diversity provided by weeds, which may entice them to visit the nearby, less attractive, potentially clove-flowering taxa of the mango flowers. And this is a term we call facilitation, where you can increase the pollination of one plant by having more floral resources by an insectary plant nearby. And the significant increase in parasitoids, again, could be because they need floral resources. So intercropping with these flowering weeds can provide these floral resources like nectar, as well as alternative larval resources for parasitoids through more host insects. So weeds can potentially keep parasitoids around mango trees and then allow them to spill over onto the mango trees via facilitation. And now looking at the fruit yield results, we saw by visual surveys by 2 different observers that we average per tree, and as well as the harvested count from the 2 harvest days of the farmer, we saw significantly more fruit when weeds were present versus when they were removed. And both the visual counts of the fruit set and the harvested counts were significantly higher in the weed treatments. And this is economically important because if you look at a kit fruit, it's a very heavy fruit. It weighs about 2 pounds on average. And the price of a kit fruit in 2019 was 14 cents per pound. And of course, this price has certainly gone up in recent years. And for the weedy treatment, we had 30 trees. So if you look at the cost and the value of this, as well as how using weeds has no costs, it led to a gain of up to $1,210 just for these 30 weedy trees, notwithstanding the added gains from not having to use herbicides, which this farmer previously did. And mango farms are incredibly large and extensive. So if you think about the value spread across a large 40-acre farm, it's very beneficial to use weeds as insectary plants. I also compared some different soil and tree health parameters between the two treatments. So looking at the soil analysis results, we didn't see a significant difference when looking at nitrogen and phosphorus between the treatments or at the beginning and in the end of the study. However, there was a significant difference in carbon, which was found to increase over time. So if we think about this, a potential reason for this could be that the presence of weeds can benefit carbon availability in the soil by adding organic matter, aiding biological cycling, and potentially decreasing runoff of carbon. So looking at the overall results and the significance of this study, we found the successful use of weeds as insectary plants to increase pollinators, parasitoids, and fruit yields. And thinking about the elimination of herbicides, this can reduce farmers' production costs and chemical use, which of course is something we want to promote, and also led to a gain of $1,210 just from the added fruit in the weed treatment. So conserving the biodiversity of plants and insects needs more focus now than ever, with increasing threats to farms, especially monocultures, in the face of climate change. And it's been found that having more biodiverse farms, which host different plants and insects, makes farms more resilient and less vulnerable to climatic stressors. So overall, the use of weeds in increasing beneficial insects and crops has shown promise. And so my suggestions for the best practices moving forward is to look at the economic ramifications of insectary plants. And in cases where there is a benefit to this approach, take advantage of the free services that they may provide. Sorry, my computer's old and slow. So with that, I'm gonna move on to what I am currently studying now. As I said, I am currently a PhD student, and my work has expanded upon my master's research. And for my PhD, one of my chapters, I am looking at companion planting in squash. So instead of using weeds, I am using two different flowering species that I introduced to you earlier, sweet alyssum and buckwheat. And these are going to be planted as insectary strips throughout a squash farm. And this research is being funded by the USDA Southern Student Research Grant. So just to introduce you to sweet alyssum and why I chose it, it is being more currently studied in farms to be used as an insectary plant, again, to provide facilitation. The flowers are very attractive, and it's called sweet alyssum for a reason. It smells very sweet, almost sickly sweet. And the flowers are small, abundant, and will attract bees, wasps, other beneficial insects. Hoverflies are a very common visitor to sweet alyssum flowers. And then the idea, as far as looking at it in squash, is that these beneficial insects will move over and onto the squash plants. And squash is a pollinator-dependent crop, and in Homestead or South Florida, we are very limited for our pollinators, and farmers will bring in these European honeybees or agricultural bees to pollinate their squash plants. However, they see that the bees are leaving the field and moving to more attractive tropical fruit farms, which are the dominant crop grown in Homestead. So these farmers have an issue with they bring in bees and the bees will still leave. And then they also just have a scarcity of our native pollinators as we have more developments in South Florida. So the idea is that having Sweet Alyssum will provide food for these beneficial insects, pollinators, and our natural enemies to increase the pollination and reduce pest populations on squash. And my second flower that I chose was buckwheat. And buckwheat, you are probably familiar with it or more familiar with it potentially because it provides many different resources. Here in the South, we use it mostly as a cover crop, and it helps to preserve nutrients in the soil and prevent leaching and erosion of soil. And it's also used as almost as a mulch. So farmers will grow it and mow it down and incorporate it back into the soil and allow it to decompose. And it helps to increase soil nutrients. And it's also used as a catch plant because it helps to incorporate phosphorus back into the soil, especially for phosphorus poor soil like we have. But I'm using it as an insectary plant because its flowers are very attractive, and it's been found that it helps to boost bees and is very attractive to native bees as well. So this is going to be planted to help to boost our bees and as well as biological control agents to help to control agricultural pests. And you may be familiar with buckwheat honey. I've never had it, but I've heard it tastes like molasses, and a lot of beekeepers will use buckwheat for their bees to feed on to produce this specialty honey. And buckwheat is a grain. It's a pseudo-cereal grain as well. So buckwheat has a lot of benefits, and in my case, I am going to be looking specifically at the flowers and the floral resources it can provide. But there's a lot that can be done with buckwheat. So my next chapter is going to be looking at tomatoes and bumblebees. So moving on, this experiment is going to be artificially heating tomatoes and bumblebees using growth chambers. And this is because tomatoes are commonly grown in South Florida and in the South in general. And they require buzz pollination via bumblebees and other buzz pollinators. And this is a mutualistic relationship where some bees, like bumblebees, will extract pollen from the anthers of tomato flowers. And they are the only ones that can do so. And about 20,000 species of plants require buzz pollination. So buzz pollinators do this by shaking the anthers of the plants. By vibrating, they flap their wings very fast, hold on to the flowers, and curve their body underneath the flowers to catch any falling pollen. And while they're vibrating, some of the pollen from previously collected flowers will move onto the stigma and pollinate that flower. So it's a mutualistic relationship between tomatoes and bumblebees. And I'll be heating them, looking at potential increases in temperature via as a result of climate change and how this will affect tomatoes and bumblebees and their interaction and pollination rates. This will play. So that was a video. You were able to hear the different sonic frequency of buzz pollination versus general flight of a bumblebee. It's a totally different process that they use to shake the pollen from the flowers. And finally, my last chapter is an experiment where I'm looking at how artificially heating eggplants in the field using open top chambers, which are commonly used to heat plants in the field by about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm going to be using this outside in the field to heat eggplants and see how temperature increases can affect eggplants and their pollinators. So I'll be looking at insect visitation and reliance on pollinators as plants are increasingly heated. And looking at a potential lapse of pollination by having a pollination exclusion treatment where eggplants will be excluded from insect pollination. And with that, I will take any questions and open for discussion. Thank you so much for your time and for your interest in my research. And thank you to the Torrey Botanical Society for funding my master's project and for having me tonight.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the talk. As a reminder, if you have any questions for Blaire, you can either use the raise hand feature, and we'll call on you, or you can just throw your questions in the chat. I would like to start. I have a question about the bees that were visiting the plants in the mango farm experiment. How common were the European honeybees versus our native bees?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And I apologize for not bringing it up and going into further detail with everybody here tonight. So mango is actually a fly, it has a fly pollination mutualism. So it's actually flies that are the pollinators of mango. Honeybees will visit the mango flowers, but if anyone has ever smelt mangoes that are flowering, they do not smell sweet. And sweet is usually to attract bees. Mango flowers smell nauseating. It usually makes me, it's not a sweet smell. So I found that flies are the best pollinators of mango, and I did put this in my papers. And specifically blowflies, which I showed in one of my photos, but I should have pointed it out. Those metallic, fat-bodied blue blowflies are the best pollinators of mango. But we do see some honeybees visiting the flowers, and very rarely native bees are stingless bees, but it was predominantly flies that are
okay. Amy, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Great talk. I'm curious as to why you switched from using a native insectary plant to non-native insectary plants in your PhD work.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was really just a matter of practicality. As I was thinking about my PhD topic and what flowers I could use and consulting with my professors and people in Florida, it was just the availability of abundant seed. I'm working on a 40-acre farm, planting over 1,000 feet of flowers, and I need a lot of seed. So to think about a native wildflower that would also grow quickly, squash is a very fast growing crop and is an annual. So planting a perennial flower insectary strip would just be pointless. It will be plowed over at the end of the season. So I just needed something with a lot of seed, will grow very quickly, and has about the same characteristics as squash as far as time to flowering and germination. But I'm open to suggestions, certainly. If there's something that falls within those parameters, I would prefer to use a native flowering species. And I thought about using bidens, but there's no one that sells that much seed of bidens. I can't collect, there's no way I could collect that much seed.
You can get it from your backyard.
Yeah, I started to, but I filled up one little bag and it wouldn't have worked out.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy.
Okay, I'm also curious about the terminology you use. Really the word weed and weeds. I feel like I don't know, I have personally been on a crusade against weeds. Like I'm always talking to my family and they're like, what's growing in my yard? Is this a weed or not a weed? And I'm like, weeds aren't real. Like it's just a plant. So is this like an agriculture? Like, I don't know. I'm just curious why. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I'm very lax with what I term a weed. For this purpose, it was anything that's not the crop that is growing in this
Sure.
farm.
Yeah.
So the definition of a weed, of course, is any wild or unwanted plant. So it's, of course, natives, non-natives, trees, shrubs, anything that is not wanted is what you could call a weed. For my purposes, it was just whatever grows on this farm. I didn't plant anything. I
Mm.
didn't single out any type of plants that I wanted to think was a weed or wasn't a weed. I'm very general with the term. And yeah, so it was open to interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And the whole idea of weeds is kind of controversial, and a lot of people have different opinions about what is a weed or what isn't. It's kind of funny.
Yes, Amy.
So another question, unless somebody else pops in. Were the farmers that you worked with, I mean, it seemed like you had really dramatic differences in productivity. Were the farmers that you were working with very surprised about that, or did they
Yeah, that's
expect that to happen, or?
no. So unofficially in the mango farming community, there's one grower who leaves weeds. His name is Dr. Richard Campbell, who it has is I think he owns some mango farms in Mexico, and he also owns some specialty farms. But he's someone that originally proposed the idea of leaving weeds in mango farms. But as far as I know, no one else thought about this. And the farmer that I worked with is a commercial grower, and uh, really just he's used herbicides every year. But after this study and seeing the results, he doesn't spray herbicides anymore, and he only mows in between the trees so that they have access roads when they harvest. But otherwise, he leaves weeds. He does remove the invasive grasses because they will just take over. They're very clumpy and they're tall and they interfere with the canopy of the trees. And any potential like palm trees that will sprout or other trees that could be growing in this farm he removes, but otherwise he leaves the flowering weeds. So it was really interesting to see, and I'm happy that I was able to do something that can actually provide immediately some benefit to farmers. And mango
Yeah.
trees, they flower thousands of more flowers than will ever become mango. So if you can increase the profitability of the trees you already have and not have to plant more farms and tear down or get rid of native habitats to have more farms, it's mango is especially easy to increase productivity on farms that are already established, especially these 40-50-year-old groves where they're really large trees and have the potential to have 400 500 mangoes on each tree. So it was a really good crop to work with and good farmers to work with.
So do you think that you're going to have as much success with your
With my
squash?
That's a touchy subject right now. I'm having some issues with the germination of the sweet alyssum, but I'm hoping I will see the results as well. It's harder with an annual crop, I will say. You deal with it's just you have to start from scratch. The mango farm the mango trees were already there, the weeds were already there, but doing something where you are planting from seed is very difficult and kind of scary. So I'm hoping the results will be as beneficial for farmers and as strong as my mango study. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
Paul, did you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Yes, this is quite beautiful indeed. I'm curious. It seems like your profitability is in some way dependent upon the life cycle of your pollinators and your parasitoids. And I'm wondering, I know halictid bees will often nest in tubes, so I'm thinking you cut down a whole bunch of reed. Just if you find the right scale of nest habitat, you could potentially multiply those, the halictids, which are beautiful creatures to some of us botanists. The other piece, though, is if you knew the life cycle of the parasitoids, I would think you could multiply that by getting in their specific habitat type. So I realize I'm complexifying your otherwise simple PhD work, but it could pay off in the thousands. I don't know. It just seems like you're already in the thousands already. So it's got to be a limiting factor, it seems, because they're just discovering, as the term has it, weeds. And I'm going to say that there are some of those creatures, and I would even maybe take a look. You're looking at the Polygonaceae with the buckwheats. Maybe see if there's a family association between the parasitoids and because you have a chance to do a multiplication there. Obviously, when you're changing from something as simple as an herbicide where you kill it all, or a pesticide, to something as complex as what you're describing, you have to partly keep your mouth shut. But it's also true that you could probably get a multiplication by getting the right
Yeah,
factors, the right pieces in place.
yeah, definitely. There's a lot that I can look at. And so for my PhD, I was focused mostly on pollinators, but of course, having these buckwheat, these in Sweet Alyssum or any insectary plant, you're going to increase potentially parasitoids as well. And looking at both at the same time is something that I'm going to try to do or attempt to do.
Without killing yourself,
But
try something simple. Like just see, because if you get the life cycle, like there's some experts someplace in Florida that knows the parasitoids very, very well.
yeah.
Call this guy up and say, what is a limiting factor on the growth and development of that population set? Because that could be a pile of, you might just get a pile of hay and set it
Yeah.
there. Some exceedingly simple. And I think that's possible because I have seen these things in good numbers come out of certain relatively localized habitats. So don't make your life complicated. Figure out how it's already been solved in some way,
Yeah.
and carry that in there. And just you just take the money to the bank with the farmer. That's all, just to supply the bag. It's going to be a plus, but just what is it? So yeah, try to avoid the complexity because that will kill you. Obviously, it always does in the PhD. But there's going to be a simple solution, I think, either at the family scale or at the habitat scale that will get you habitat level that will get you some kind of increase in what you're looking at.
Yeah, and especially for squash farms where there's absolutely nothing. There's no trees, there's
Yeah.
no resources for the differing life cycles of these insects. I'm kind of just hoping they'll come because flowers are there, but adding something, say like a nesting resource, like you were saying, could provide many different benefits.
And if you possibly could, you can maybe do it with the drone and infrared radiation, infrared, basically CO2. If you can, because as you know, if you say botany, they cut your grants in half or whatever. If you say carbon capture, now there, and I think you could probably justify something like this, and it would be valuable as well. So you don't have to admit you're a botanist. You just tell them you're capturing carbon, and they will, I think, write a better check.
Thank you. That's a good point.
All right, we also have a question from the chat. So, are flower type weeds the only weeds that are beneficial to mangoes, or can the invasive grasses also be beneficial?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I'm going to say only the flowering weeds as far as improving pollination. The grasses, the flowers are not anything that are very attractive to the pollinators of mango, and the grasses are something that farmers really have a disdain for and requested that they be removed because they're invasive, they will spread and inhibit the growth of these native, smaller, low-lying flowers. And they interfere also with the harvesting process of mango. So those are something that I don't see personally a benefit for leaving, especially if they're invasive. But that's nothing that's specifically been studied. But I would say leaving the flowering herbaceous weed species, preferably native, is something you would want to boost before thinking about grasses.
Hey, Molly, did you have a question?
Well, that touches a little bit on my question. When I talk to, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, but when I talk to people in Virginia about planting more, letting stuff grow, not farmers, snakes are always one of the
Yeah.
things that they would worry about. Do mango farmers in Florida even think about that, or snakes just such a part of life in Florida that they
Oh
don't
my
think about
gosh.
that?
Molly, you brought up a wonderful point. I had so many snakes in my weed treatment. Every day I would go, if it was after rain, undoubtedly I would see a snake. And because I'm crouching down in the weeds, it was face to face every time. And they're usually they're just rat snakes, the black racers that we have. But the snakes were everywhere in the weeds, and rats and mice, and just so many things that I didn't expect to see were harbored by the weeds. I will say that I did see when the rats and the mice died in the weed treatment, the blowflies would lay their eggs in them, and there is some kind of relationship, of course, that you can have um more dead animals, more blowflies, more pollination of your mango trees.
Mhm.
And another point is some farmers in Mexico will put out cans of cat food to provide for flies to lay eggs in. They really like cat food. And so you can boost your blowfly population like that. So it's a really interesting relationship. And the snakes, I will admit, I'm not the biggest fan, especially when they're just popping up out of nowhere and I'm in the field alone. But it was interesting to see the blowflies and the rats. I will say that. And of
That's
course, they're
fascinating.
free. Blowflies are free. You put out cat food and you have free pollinators. Whereas these farmers are paying to bring in honeybees and they're not even the best pollinator of mango. So if you have a mango tree, something to think about. Cat
Thank
food.
you. That's fascinating.
Mhm.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's bad memories, but it's important.
Well, even in New York, people think about snakes in their outside the city in their just gardening decisions.
Yeah,
So thank you.
it's so important. I mean, you're increasing everything. Anything that otherwise wouldn't have refuge. By leaving these big stands of plants, you're going to be increasing all kinds of animals. And luckily, I didn't see any venomous snakes. Of course, we have a lot of them down here, but even just the rat snakes were too much for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Molly.
All right, last call for any questions. Okay, I like to end with the same question for every speaker. So, and you can take a couple seconds to think about it if you like, but if there's like one main takeaway that you would want everyone in the audience to go home with, leave the Zoom with, what from your work, what would it be?
Okay, thank you. Right now I'm leaning towards making agriculture more stable as a in looking at climate change and heat stress and habitat destruction and pollinator decline. So I think just as someone who works in agroecology as my field, looking at increasing diversity, of course, is something you guys are all probably thinking about as well, having diversity of floral resources and plants and insects. But I think there's a real benefit to having more diverse farms, backyards, gardens, um, you know, urban areas, increasing diversity everywhere you can to help to stabilize our ecological interactions and help them persevere in the face of climate change And there's been a few recent studies that have looked at how these agroecological farms with trees and herbs and cows and having more diverse farming systems and diverse ecology in general can help you be more resilient against climate change. So that's something I think everyone should think about, even though it may look messy. And the weed treatment certainly looked very messy in the farm, and people stopped and said, "What's going on? Why is this farmer leaving the weeds? Does he, is his machine broken?" But don't be afraid of having a messy garden or leaving weeds if you know they're a native flower and it's in your backyard, leaving it though it may not be sightly. It can be more productive, and you can help to preserve these animals and insects that are really struggling. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great message. Thank you again for being here and talking with us, and thank you to everyone in the audience. Don't forget to check out torreybotanical.org for more information on the society, and have a good evening. Bye, everyone.